Okay. Okay, so when we talk about logic, remember that logic governs the rules for correct thinking, right? But it also governs, because it governs the rules for correct thinking, it also governs the way that these thoughts are connected to each other, okay? So in order to reach a certain conclusion, you have to connect your thoughts in a particular, you have to also connect your words in a particular way, to connect your thoughts in a particular way in order for your conclusion to be valid, okay? We talked about this a little bit when we talked about rules of inference, if you remember. If you add up stuff, this plus this equals this is a terrible person, right? If you don't add them up right, or if your facts aren't right, if your data is not good, then your conclusion is going to be wrong. So logic helps us. We talked about the rules of logic already, okay? Then we talked about the rules for proper inference, and now we're going to kind of put those together and show you what it looks like in a formal, this is called a formal argument structure, okay? So when philosophers, if you ever read any philosophy papers or anything like that, you'll see this kind of stuff all throughout their paper. It's pretty interesting. But a formal argument, okay, a formal argument is a premise or premises, okay, the plural of premise is premises, and then a conclusion. Okay, now there isn't really any limit to how many premises you can have in an argument, but a classic argument will have 2 or 3 premises. This is a classical argument. Okay? A syllogism, which is what this is called, a syllogism, I'll give you the word, it's Syllogism. Syllogism. A syllogism is 2 premises and a conclusion. Okay? Syllogism. So this is how it works, and it really is listed just like this. It's got premise 1, and then premise 2 underneath it, and then any other premises, right, if you need them, and then usually a line across this way, almost like a math problem, right? And then you have the conclusion underneath the line. Okay? Sometimes it says the word therefore, sometimes it's just the next number in the list, like this will be 1, 2, and then the conclusion will be 3. Sometimes it'll be referenced by a triangle, like that, or a series of dots that look like a triangle, like that. It's just a symbol for therefore. Okay? That indicates the conclusion. Okay, look, this structure is valid. There are 2 things that an argument structure has to be: valid and sound. Okay, valid and sound. This structure is valid. Okay, validity has to do with the structure of the argument, how it's put together, and the fact that this conclusion follows from these premises. Okay, when you add up these premises, then the conclusion follows. Okay, that's valid. It means the argument's valid. If the argument is sound, that means the content in the premises are also true. Remember the example of I have a red cube in my pocket, right? That's logically possible, but it's untrue. I don't have a red cube in my pocket, although my dress does have pockets. But I don't have a red cube in my pocket, okay? So it's logically possible, but it's not sound because it's not true. So you could have an argument that looks just like this, but the premises are crap. Okay, they're not true at all. They sound true, but they're not true. They talk about stuff that doesn't exist or whatever, right? So the argument is valid, but it's not sound. What you want is an argument that is both valid and sound. Okay? So validity and soundness. Validity has to do with the way it's structured. Soundness has to do with its content, what it's actually talking about. All right? Good so far? There we go. Okay. There's 2 different types of arguments. Okay, 2 different types. And this has to do with the relationship between the premises and the conclusion. Okay, there's 2 different types of relationships that can exist, and that forms 2 different types of arguments. The first one is a deductive argument. You probably are familiar with this word deductive or deduce, right? I'm going to deduce that. Okay, like detectives sometimes say this word and that kind of thing. Okay, a deductive argument means the conclusion of the argument must follow from the premises. In other words, if the premises are true, and that sometimes is a big if, but if they are true, then the conclusion has to be true. It's forced to be true. The relationship between the premises and the conclusion is so tight that if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. It's just kind of like, oh, well, yeah. There's no way that it can't be true if the premises are true. So, premises in this type of argument are allegedly they're based on truth, okay, or at least they try to be, unless somebody's trying to deceive you. All of the facts needed are contained in the premises, so you take it exactly as the premises are written, and you don't need to go get any other information or smuggle in any information in any other way. You just read the argument, you're limited by the confines of the argument, and then it's designed to make watertight conclusions. It has to be true. If this and this is true, then it has to be true. Okay? Remember way back when we were talking about, you probably don't remember, but you might anyways, when we were talking about the story of philosophy, and I said at one point that there was a time when we were kind of going in between empiricism and rationalism, and there was a guy, or scholasticism, right, where like everyone was all about like God and trying to read through like scripture and interpret classical works by scripture and that kind of stuff. And there was a guy in there who came up with 6 rational proofs for the existence of God. Do you remember me saying that? Something like that? Okay, there are 6 rational proofs. By rational, I mean he doesn't appeal to any holy texts. Okay, they're rational. So he tries to approach it by logic. Okay, one of those, well, a couple of them are, but the one I'm thinking of is a deductive argument. Meaning, if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. Okay? It goes like this. The universe came about by either physical necessity, chance, or design. The universe came about either by physical necessity, chance, or design. It did not come about by physical necessity or chance. Therefore, conclusion, it had to be design. Now, those are big ifs, right? Those are big ifs in the premises. But if those premises are true, then you see how the conclusion has to be true. If it's true that the universe came about by physical necessity or chance or design, you have any other options? Nope. That's pretty much just it, right? Physical necessity, chance, or design. And if it's true that the universe did not come about by physical necessity or chance, then by process of elimination, it has to be design. Does that make sense? So the burden then in trying to prove the argument to be true is to show the truth of the premises, and then the conclusion will naturally follow. Does that make sense? It's a deductive argument. Now the weight is in the premises, because that's a big burden to shoulder. Okay? If they are true, it's kind of one of those really big, like, either way, it's a watershed thing, right? If they're not true, the whole argument fails. If they are true, the whole argument succeeds, right? So there's a lot of weight resting in those premises, but you see how the deductive arguments can be really powerful that way, okay? If the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. Just logically it has to be, by the way it's worded. Make sense? You good? Jesse, you good?
Yeah, I'm sleepy.
You need to stand up and walk about a little bit? Stand on the back? You're welcome to if you need to.
Yeah, I'll keep that in mind.
Okay, an inductive argument. Okay, this one's not exactly the same. This one doesn't say that the conclusion is guaranteed to be true. It says that it's likely to be true. Okay, this just narrows the playing field and gives it, yeah, it's probably true beyond a reasonable doubt. Okay, the premises again are allegedly based on fact. Okay, in an argument like this, but some of the facts in the conclusion are implied. They're not stated outright. Okay, this means that you kind of get like in the ballpark for what we're talking about, and it doesn't mean that it's absolutely true, but it means that probably you're right. As an example, lawyers use this all the time. Okay, when they're trying to prove that somebody is guilty, they line up a bunch of evidence. Think of those as premises. Okay, so we got fingerprints. The guy has no alibi. We got other DNA. We got an eyewitness. I know the guy says he's innocent, but we got these 4 things. I've proven that he's guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Does that make sense? Is it watertight that guy did it? Is there some weird way, you know those crime shows that are out there, some bizarre way that somebody could have framed him or something? Probably. Right? Probably. Okay, eyewitnesses are notoriously untrustworthy. I mean, all that kind of stuff, right? Maybe he didn't have an alibi because he just was by himself. He needed some alone time, some me time. Okay? I mean, right, there's all sorts of things that could happen. You see how if I have these four things of evidence, that doesn't mean, oh, well, obviously then it's not possible that he couldn't have done it. He had to have done it. You see how that's not the same, right? It's likely that he did it. Okay, I mean, the weight of evidence is definitely against him, but it's not watertight. It is, however, beyond a reasonable doubt, and most juries and judges would accept that. Right? That's the task of a lawyer, is to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. Most of the time they can't prove watertight. Okay? Even if a guy confesses, you can't prove watertight. But you can prove beyond a reasonable doubt. Does it make sense, the difference between the two? Okay. A lot of times, and we kind of talked about it a little bit with the lawyer stuff, but a lot of times most of the time, you won't see these arguments listed premise, conclusion, okay? They're just not that easy, sorry. So most of the time, we hear them a lot, and we participate in them a lot in conversation. We just don't lay them out, right? We don't write them out like that, okay, on a piece of paper or something like that. But this is how we communicate. We communicate when we're trying to prove a point, when we're trying to convince somebody of something. This is what we do. We lay out reason 1, reason 2, reason 3. Therefore, you should let me do this, or you should come with me, or you should give me this, or I should be able to do that, or you should stop doing that, right? We have something we want to convince someone of. And so what do? We lay out reasons why they should think like we do. We do it all the time, okay? It happens in discourse all the time. So it's not always clear. It's not always in the right order. Sometimes we lead with the conclusion. Come on, Mom, give me the keys. Let me borrow the car this weekend. All right, that's our conclusion. Then she says why, and then we go into all of our premises for our argument. Right? Okay? So just to get your brain going and to ruin all commercials for you ever, because commercials try to do this too. They just do it with fallacies instead of with real arguments. Okay, indicative terms, little flags, okay, that tell you that arguments are happening, premises and conclusions are happening. If somebody says therefore, no one says hence anymore. Sometimes I say it at my house just to make people laugh, but okay, consequently or so this is what should happen. That means that you're about to state some kind of conclusion. Okay? If somebody says like since, for, or because, then somebody's starting to state a premise. Okay, here's an example. So because I'm nerdy, I'm trying to teach my 4-year-old to communicate with me in a reasonable way. I recognize he's 4. Okay, I get that. I'm only within his boundaries, but I'm trying to get him to, instead of just telling him he can't whine for stuff, like don't whine, don't fuss about things, right? That's not how you get stuff. Instead of, I tell him that, but then I'm also trying to teach him what he should do instead of that. Okay, so the other day he was trying to tell me that he needed to have. He wanted to go to Walmart to get a toy, like an action figure. He's got all those action figures from like Marvel stuff and everything. So he's like, he wanted to go get another one. He wanted to go get, I believe he wanted to get Ant-Man. He had several of them, like Hulk and Iron Man and stuff like that. He wanted to get Ant-Man. So he told me this, and I said, at first I said, I don't know, and he started to kind of, I said, no, Whit, don't whine about it. Tell me why you think we should go get one. Okay, want him to learn to communicate, but I also want him to learn to connect his actions to consequences, right? So tell me why you think we should go get one. So he said, because I want one, right? What's the conclusion? I want to go get one of these. We should go get Ant-Man at the store, okay? Why? Here's a premise 1, because I want one. And I said, okay, for a 4-year-old, that's a pretty good reason. Right? But give me another good reason why you think you should go get one. He thought and said, because I don't have one. I don't have Ant-Man. That's legit, right? For a 4-year-old, I want one, I don't have one. Most of the time, that's as far as they get, right? I want one, I don't have one. Therefore, I need one. Okay, that's like a basic 4-year-old argument for anything that you want, okay? So I decided to press him a little bit, and I said, okay, that's really good, buddy. Tell me another good reason. You got to give a good reason why we should go get one. And he said, no joke, Because I talked to Hulk, and Hulk said he wants to see Ant-Man. And I was like, that's legit. Let's go get one. Because, yeah, so he started like bringing in all these, right? So you can see that the thought process was going. I need to like connect this. Okay, so now I'm going to make up stuff, right? So I don't have any other. Okay, same thing. So this is a conversation we have, but he's building an argument is what he's doing. And I'm trying to teach him to do this so that he can speak for what he wants, make a case for what he wants. All right, does this make sense? We do this all the time. So listen for it. Listen for it. Next time you really want something or somebody's trying to get you to do something, listen to their conclusion and try and think about their premises. Okay. So here we go into the rabbit hole. So logic kind of has its own language a little bit. The arguments are set up in if-then statements, and they use P and Q to stand for things. Okay, kind of like X and Y in algebra, right? It's P and Q in logic. Two places that the phrase mind your P's and Q's came from. One was from the printing press, a lowercase p and a lowercase q look the same, but they're backwards, right? From each other, okay? So you got to set the type backwards in a old printing press. So mind your P's and Q's, right? Make sure you set them the right way. And this is the other one, mind your P's and Q's, because it's part of logic language. Okay, so P follows the if and is called the antecedent. You guys are going to know this. Ante stands for before. You need to know this. P is the antecedent, okay? Q is called the consequent. It's not like the consequence, but it's the consequent, okay? P follows the if and is the antecedent. Q follows the then and is the consequent. All right, so let me give you an example. Oh, necessary and sufficient. We'll get back to that here in a second. Okay, here's what it looks like. If P, then Q. That's premise one. Okay, premise two. We have P. So if these are true, right, I know you've already seen this, but look, if these two premises are true, if it's true that if we have P, whatever P is, then we have Q, whatever Q is, if that's true, and if it's also true that we have P, then what follows from that? We have Q, right? Because of the first premise. So is this a deductive argument or an inductive argument?
Deductive.
Why?
Because you have P then Q. Actually.
Why is it deductive? You're
Because
right
the
that it's
conclusion
deductive.
Immediately follows the premise.
Okay, what do you mean by immediately follows? What does deductive mean? The conclusion is
Right,
You're
to
saying
lead up
something.
to the conclusion.
Should.
that, well, yeah, I mean, it could be true in an inductive.
The information
Argument
from the
too.
conclusion must be found
It must-
in the
yeah.
premises.
This must be true. It has to be. Has to be true. Based on this, now look, just within the confines of this argument, look, we don't even know what the heck P and Q is, but just within the confines of this argument, whatever it is, we see that if these two premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. You see that? Has to be. If they're true, then that has to be true. You see that? Okay? Okay, here's an example. Let's fill in the P and Q with something meaningful, okay? So if it rains, the grass will be wet. So P stands for if it rains, right? And Q stands for the grass will be wet. All right? So if it rains, the grass will be wet. Premise two, it rained. If these are true, what follows?
The grass.
Yeah. Now look, is this argument valid? Is it valid? What does validity mean? Structurally, yeah. It's structurally in the right order, right? Structurally good.
Yeah,
Okay. Yeah. Is it sound?
Yeah.
I mean, let's just say it rained.
Yeah.
Okay? Yeah. What if I said, if it rains, the grass will be purple? It rained, therefore the grass is purple. Is the argument valid? Yes. Structurally good, right? It's all about the structure.
Okay, yeah.
In other words, if this is true, and if this is true, the conclusion has to be true. If it's true that when it rains, the grass turns purple, and if it rained, then the grass will be purple. Does that make sense? But is it sound? No, because that doesn't exist. That's not a thing that happens. Okay? You see the difference between the two? Okay, this particular argument is called modus ponens, okay, which is Latin for in the mood of affirming. Okay, affirming. Affirming means we're going to affirm this, whatever this is, P is. And what is P? The consequent or the antecedent?
Antecedent.
Yeah, it comes before. Ante means before, okay? And Q is the consequent. So we're going to affirm the antecedent. Okay? We're going to affirm. Yes, we have P. Affirm the antecedent. All right? So modus ponens in the mood of affirming. Here's another example. If John studies hard, that's P, right? He will get a good grade. That's Q. John studies hard. Therefore, based only on those premises, what will happen? Yeah. If he studies hard, he will get a good grade. He studies hard, therefore he'll get a good grade. So is it valid? Is it in the right structure?
Yeah,
Is it sound?
no,
Why not?
because he could just not understand the material.
He could luck into a good grade. I mean, it says if John studies hard, he will get a good grade.
You could get last minute test.
Just on the information given.
Just on the
Yeah,
information
yeah.
given, it's valid and sound. Yeah. Good? Okay, here's another one. Now, instead of affirming the antecedent, we're going to deny the consequent. And never the two shall mix. If you're going to affirm, you can only affirm the antecedent. And if you're going to deny, you can only deny the consequent. Okay? So look, if P, then Q. Not Q. We're going to deny the consequent. Therefore, not P. Okay? P and Q go together, right? We don't have Q, we don't have P. Make sense? Okay, example. If it rains, the grass will be wet. Excuse me. The grass is not wet.
So therefore
Therefore, it didn't rain. What would happen if I denied the antecedent? Here I'm denying the consequent. What would it sound like if I denied the antecedent? First one would be the same, right? If it rains, the grass will be wet. Deny the antecedent for me.
That's not right.
It didn't
It
rain.
didn't rain.
Therefore,
Grass got wet.
okay, is that a valid structure? Nope. It's sound, but it's not valid because what happens? Think about it. If it rains, the grass will be wet. It did not rain, therefore the grass is not wet.
The grass could still be wet even though it hadn't rained.
Yeah, like why?
Information given us.
Like why? Dog,
Lawn maintenance and
right?
care.
Yeah.
None of that information was given though.
No, it's not because no, it's not given us. But the point is that it's not a valid structure because it leaves that open. It leaves it open for possibilities.
Is it because you deny the antecedent?
Yes. That's why you can't deny the antecedent. If you're going to deny, you can only deny the consequent. And to keep it valid. To keep it valid. Okay, here's another one. If Joan, we got John and Joan, how about that? If Joan has been working out, then she can run the 5K. Joan can't run the 5K, therefore Joan has not been working out. All right. Here's a third example. This is called the disjunctive. That's a fun word. It sounds a little bit like a disease, but disjunctive, okay? Now instead of if then, we have either or, okay? Either P or Q. Can't have them both, like the other one. If you have one, like the other ones, if you have P, you have Q. In this one, either P or Q, okay? Not P. You could also say not Q if you wanted to in this one. Therefore, right, if you say not P, then you're going to have Q. It's either one or the other. Either P or Q, not P, therefore Q. Okay, here's an example. Either I will grade the papers myself, or I will enlist the help of my work study, but not both. Okay, either I will grade the papers myself, or think about the law of the excluded middle, right? It's either one or the other. Okay, either I'll grade the papers myself or I'll enlist the help of my work study. I will not grade the papers myself. So where does that leave us? I'm going to use my work study, right? I could just as easily do it the other way. I will not use my work study. Therefore, what am I left with? I'm going to have to grade it myself. Okay, it's called a disjunctive, either or. Okay. Okay, let's go back then to necessary and sufficient. Okay. In these examples, in this argument structure, you guys are going to have to strap it on for these last few minutes, okay, because it's difficult. We're going to revisit it on Wednesday, but necessary and sufficient is difficult, and also the number one way that people make mistakes in their reasoning and in their communication. Bar none. Like, really, it all happens here. Okay, P is a sufficient condition for Q. Q is a necessary condition for P. Okay, let's define these. A sufficient condition is a condition that is adequate for another condition to occur. Okay, if it's sufficient, that means, okay, yeah, it can occur. Okay, if it's necessary, for example, if rain is sufficient for wet, then every time you have rain, you have wet. Okay, rain is a sufficient condition for wetness to happen. Does that make sense? Sort of. Okay, contrast it with this. Hang on, it's going to be confused, but hang on. Contrast it with necessary. Necessary condition is a condition that must prevail in order for another thing to happen. So in other words, necessary means you've got to have it and some other things. Sufficient means it's enough to get the job done.
All forms of precipitation will get the ground wet. Rain is just one of them.
So if you want wetness to happen,
You have to have precipitation that's necessary. But sufficient is rain.
yeah. But really, not really, because there are other ways you can get the ground wet. Like,
That's why it's sufficient, but not necessary.
yes, I see what you're saying. Yes. Sort of, yeah. So you've got, okay, so if you're going to have red, you want to get the color red, right? Then color, let's just say color as a category, okay, is necessary. You got to have color in order to have red. If you don't have color at all, the concept of color, you're not going to have red, okay? But in order to just have the concept of color, you realize you got all the colors in there, right? So that's sufficient, or it's necessary to have the concept of color, but you also got to have something else specific in order to get redness in there. Does that kind of make sense? A little bit? It's one of those things where some people, it clicks and you're like, oh yeah, I got that. Other people, you're like, what? And if you're like me, you'll labor over it for a while, and then it will slowly start to click. Okay? Think of if you're a visual person, think of sufficient like a big circle, okay? Anywhere in here, it'll get the job done. Okay? Necessary is like, we got to have this plus something else in here. But you've got to have that particular one. Okay? Necessary is like smaller, and sufficient is bigger, if that makes sense. But necessary is a little more necessary, right? It's a little more precise. Okay, we got to have that exactly. Okay? We are going to talk about, I'll have a whole sheet full of stuff that we'll read through, and I'm going to ask you whether they're necessary and sufficient.
You said necessary is bigger?
No, sufficient's bigger.
Sufficient is bigger.
Yeah. Sufficient's enough to it'll get the job done. Anywhere in there, it'll get the job done.
So sufficient's pretty broad, and what was it, necessary is
Necessary.
pretty specific.
It's precise.
So you
Really
have to have
precise.
specific,
Yeah.
okay.
So, I'm gonna use
I understood what you
like a little thing to try to explain it to me. Necessary would be like, if you were making and baking something and you needed butter, and it had to have butter.
Yes,
Butter,
yes.
but you, instead of using eggs, you could use something like applesauce, so that applesauce would be sufficient.
Okay, think about, you're close. You're like halfway there. Okay, think about this. If you're trying to bake a cake, is butter necessary or sufficient to bake a cake?
Is there an example of that?
Because there's
thought it was
margarine
margarine.
in butter, right? So you could choose.
So like, let's say, okay,
So
what
it's
can we?
pretty necessary.
I thought that's what you were
Flour,
trying to make.
okay, flour, okay, flour. If you're gonna bake a cake, flour. Is that necessary or sufficient for baking a cake? Why?
Because it
You
helps
can't
our
make a cake
eyes.
without it.
You can't make a cake without it, but you also need other things, right? It's not sufficient for a whole cake, but you have to have it. Does that help?
It's
Okay,
necessary for
sunlight and flowers growing. Is sunlight necessary or sufficient to grow flowers?
Sunlight's necessary.
Necessary, why?
Sunlight's bigger than the flower.
Yeah, there's a
It
size
needs
thing.
powers
It
their
needs
cells
the-
and causes them to make food.
Without
Is it
yeah,
necessary because why?
They metabolize the light into food.
No, logically, is it necessary? Yeah, it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. Why isn't it sufficient?
Because they need water too. They
Because
can't
you
just
need
live
other
off the
things
sunlight.
besides sunlight, but you gotta have sunlight.
Okay.
Is that making more sense? Okay,
So it's necessary to have sunlight. It's sufficient to have sunlight and water, and whatever fertilizer, whatever else it would take.
whatever else it needs, yeah.
for a plant. Okay.
Let's see, my birthday is March 7th. Is that necessary or sufficient for having a birthday in the spring? Sufficient. Why?
Because spring is a problem.
Because it'll get the job done, right? It's in spring, but could it have been March 17th? Could it have been April 2nd? Right? Yeah, okay. Anywhere in there, right? Anywhere in there, I could have got the job done. So that's sufficient. Does that make sense? A little more?
Back to your flower example.
Okay.
It's not necessary for the sun to provide light for the flower. The light is necessary, but the sun is not necessary in that. So if that,
Okay, if you got like a full spectrum light
Yeah.
or something, okay,
I'm
smart guy.
I'm just
I
seeing
don't-
it.
Right,
if,
but
if
I mean-
it is necessary, what's the difference?
Yeah, but
How do you
don't
make
think-
it sufficient. How do
Yeah.
you
Don't think about it so much as the actual content. Think about it as a relationship between the things. I mean, light, yeah. Okay, so we'll just take light. But yeah,
I was just trying to flop it.
yeah, you're okay.
I understand it.
You got it? Okay. Okay, real quick, and then we'll stop, okay? So now that we know argument structure, you know a little bit more about fallacies. You already read love as a fallacy. So look, you've got two big categories of fallacies, okay? Formal and informal. The formal ones are the ones we just talked about, basically, right? If you affirm the consequent and deny the antecedent, right, which is the opposite of what you're supposed to do, then you run into problems, like we saw with the grass and the other ways it could have been wet, right? Okay, so if you flip-flop those, that's a formal fallacy because you're messing with the formal structure of an argument, okay? Another one is false dilemma, which was also talked about in Love is Fallacy, I think, and then self-refutation. If you have these two deal with the validity of the argument structure. These two deal with the soundness, okay? If the content in there refutes itself, right, or limits you to a false dilemma, okay, then that's also a formal fallacy because it's messing with a formal argument structure. But there's a lot of informal fallacies that we use all the time that aren't necessarily part of an argument structure. We just use them in our regular discourse, okay? Bandwagon is a big one all the time. We use it, right? We appeal to the bandwagon. We appeal to pity a lot. Okay? We're not necessarily trying to prove a point in like a formal way. We're just talking and trying to make our ideas be powerful, and to make our ideas be influential, we're just using fallacies to do it. So they're not as influential as they could be. Okay? Fallacies are bad. Not as bad as relativism, but bad.
Let's not talk about that again. That was horrible.
Relativism is bad.
That
Okay.
cut my head.
So this is what's going to happen then on Wednesday. We're going to finish talking about necessary and sufficient, and we're going to review for an exam. And you're going to have an exam on Friday. Okay?
Hey.
We're examining over logic.
Yes.
This is my last consort.